How to achieve goals? I hear this question all the time, and it reveals one of the biggest and strongest delusions of mankind. I think this delusion is as strong as the one which states that you have to experience negative emotions because they were given to you by nature and you can't actually get rid of them. So the delusion about goals states that goals are hard to achieve. Why am I saying that this is delusion? In fact, people are really persistent in achieving their goals. Whatever they want to achieve, evolutionary, they have been achieving. That's why they actually survived. So, in case they have a goal and they cannot achieve it, or it's really hard for them to achieve, that would mean that their goal is different, and their goal is it's not what they're stating, not what they're declaring. If I'm suffering and I'm saying that I want to stop suffering, but I keep suffering, and I'm saying that this goal is really hard to achieve, it's really hard to stop being depressed, that means that, in fact, I really want to be depressed. I want to stay being depressed. And the real goal would be, the real task would be here, it's not to try and force myself into stop being depressed, thinking that I have this goal, but it would be to restate the goals and to admit and realize that my real goal is to keep being depressed. And the real goal should be how to change my goals from being depressed to actually... When we talk about launching the satellite or creating a large profitable business, it's easy to understand why it's hard. But usually when people talk about goals, it's not as hard. It's not about launching the satellite, or it's not about creating that large business. It's usually way more simple, and in personal life, people actually are really good in achieving their goals. The brain is smart, and every person is smart enough to try and use maybe 5 or 10 tools, to come up with those 5 or 10 tools, to try them when they are suffering. For example, I'm stating that I want to stop feeling self-pity, but time goes by, and every time I find myself in self-pity state. That only means that I want to be in that state of self-pity. Even if I can present and describe the few efforts I've tried to get myself out of self-pity, like I try to force myself out of self-pity, I try to imagine myself and jump into a state where I'm not experiencing self-pity and I'm experiencing something else, something more pleasant. Or I try to eliminate self-pity, or I try to do a push-up to just see if it helps. And it doesn't help, that means I want to stay in self-pity, because it's really easy to try a method, to try a tool and see if it works or not. Then try another one, and one of them will really work. It's really easy for everyone to find some tools which will work for you personally. And everybody can do that. So in case if I'm setting that goal again and again and I cannot achieve it, and I try all those tools and they do not work, I have to find a reason why I want to stay in that state, why I want to feel self-pity again and again. I have to ask myself, why do you need this state? What advantages does it bring you? The reasons why people want to suffer, for example, why they want to feel depressed or feeling self-pity again, they can be different. For example, kids like to be sick sometimes because the advantages are obvious. If you're sick, you don't have to go to school, you can stay in bed, all your relatives will be jumping around you, giving you food and trying to entertain you. This is not going to happen if you're healthy and you have to go to school. You actually will be kicked out to the school. Everybody's playing with you. I had some experience with kids. I lived with kids, and it was astonishing how fast a kid can actually change their behavior when they are staying with their parents or with a person who doesn't give them the pity or attention out of self-pity which they require. For example, I remember the situation when the kid had to stay with me, and the mother was going for work. So the kid was running after the mother, crying and demanding something from her, and she was saying, "Oh, my poor Andrew, you have to stay with Elka, and I will come back, and we'll see what we can do." And as soon as the door closed, Andrew turned into a completely different kid. He stopped crying. He went to his room and started to play with his toys, and he didn't come for pity to me because he already knew that it's not going to happen. The flexibility of this change was really astonishing. But as soon as his mother came back, in 2 seconds the kid switched back into that whiny and demanding kid who started being hysterical immediately, started to demand some attention from his mother. If he falls down, he would be screaming and crying, and she will take him to her hands, and she will be giving him chocolates or something. Kids' psyche is really flexible, but adult psyche is really flexible too. It's not way less flexible than the kids' one. So it's really easy to switch from the self-pity state to a normal, just enjoyably living state. I remember it by myself. A few days ago I was walking somewhere in the street and I found myself in a self-pity state. And I stopped myself immediately and I asked, why do you want to be in this state? Why do you want to enjoy this state? What advantages does it give you? And I realized that I imagined some people I know who would be giving me attention, who would be saying, "Oh no, of course you have to stay in bed if you feel pain here, you don't have to walk, you don't push yourself, you don't have to do this and that." I used it as an excuse to not do some things which I think I should do. As soon as I realized it, I remember, I think I've done some silly joke about myself too, because it really helps to get out of suffering state. And I went out of that state in a few seconds. And I almost felt disappointed that I have no reason anymore to feel self-pity or suffering. There is no reason at all. Even if something bad happens, there is no reason. I'm not talking about severe physical pain right now. That might be a bit harder to get rid of, self-pity. But most of the time we don't feel any strong physical pain. There are no some crazy circumstances that would make you suffer a lot. It's the same thing with adults right now. If you're adult and if you're sick, you have an excuse to not perform some motions, routines, which you think you should perform. The first thing would be going to work. You don't have to go to work, or you can actually go to work, but you can tell everybody that you're sick, and people will be saying, "Oh, poor you, you're sick, it's so good that you came to work," so you can also feel hero, plus you get all the attention from people around. You shouldn't be training because you feel sick. You shouldn't be doing your homework or whatever. Another reason why people want to feel self-pity and depression and suffering so much is the interpretations of the fact that were implemented to them by their parents, for example, by society. The very bright example would be for being raped. Many kids in childhood were raped mentally or physically, more or less. I know a lot of people who were telling me some details about being forced into some sexual action or saying being mentally raped. But let's talk about the physical part. And yeah, it's not pleasant, of course, but why is it not pleasant? For example, imagine that you broke your leg. If the leg is broken, it's way more unpleasant physically, because you have to wear a cast for a month, there are lots of pains, you cannot do lots of things, it's itches and so on. Technically, it's way more unpleasant than being raped. But why being raped is a justification for being traumatized for the rest of the life. Just because there is an interpretation that even placing the penis in vagina is somehow a very spectacular and particular separate, it has a separate, strong and heavy meaning. But if it happens by force, then it's like a full justification to carry the trauma till the rest of your life. And I think that it's not as big a problem, the rape itself, because, as I said, it's way easier to survive than breaking the leg or having some complicated surgery. But it's a real sadism of the parents to implement the idea of catastrophe in their heads of the children. So if you're told that being raped is a catastrophe, you can have a justification of suffering for the rest of your life. And even if it happened when you were 5 years old, when you're 45, you still have that trauma from your childhood, which you can experience, and you can tell people that that's a huge suffer. I had a uncle in my family, and he was touching me very unpleasantly in the places where I didn't want him to touch me. And I really hated him, and I understood that my parents didn't do anything about that too, because they knew that. Because he's an uncle, he's part of your family, you have to be fine with that. They tried to get him away from me, but in the end, he never placed his penis in my vagina, but he did touch me, and I remember that feeling. My brain fully caught this memory, and when I remembered it, it happened a few years ago, the first thought was like, oh, such a catastrophe, somebody's been raping me in my childhood. And I almost found that I started to look for attention from my friends. And my friends didn't give me that attention. They told me, oh yeah, okay. And when I started to get offended because they didn't give me that attention, I expected them to say, oh, poor you, poor Elka, you were raped. It's so horrible. We understand that it's such a trauma till the rest of your life. But they made the joke about it, and then we discussed it, and I told them about me being offended. And they made that joke, and then we discussed it, and I realized that I want to carry that. I want to carry that interpretation of being raped as a child, because I want to suffer. But as soon as I wasn't given that attention, I realized that stupidity. So yeah, I was raped when I was a kid, and I don't care. What are the other reasons why people want to suffer, for example? And in a modern world, it's even good to be a suffering person, because it makes you look like you're a deep person, deeply feeling person. Lots of people will give you an example of artists and writers who has been suffering, and that's why they wrote such a perfect pictures or books. If they weren't suffering, they would be boring. They would be boring, happy people. So back to the topic, if you see a person who declares that he or she wants to stop being unhappy, but they keep being unhappy, that will mean that this person wants to be unhappy. And if they actually ask you the question, what to do to stop being unhappy, they can even start to aggressively defend their right to be unhappy if you give them an actual idea how to stop doing that. And if you find yourself in doing some things and setting the goals which you cannot achieve, that means you're engaged in a Sisyphean toil of doing something you don't really want. And you have to change the goal, you have to reset the goal, and you have to find the reasons why you want to be unhappy. And it's an important and necessary step before actually trying to change something. You can be in two positions here. In a position of a person who thinks that there are some people who can achieve goals, who are talented enough to achieve goals, some mysterious ability to achieve goals, or you can become an engineer and find why you don't have those goals in reality, why you have different goals, and how to translate the goals you want to have, how to start having the goals you want to have instead of having the goals you don't want to have. It's easier to do all this job in digging into your reasons and finding the real goals with somebody else. So if you want to try and do that, you can text me or write me an email. All my information is in the channel description, and I'll be happy to ask you some questions and see what can be possibly the goals you're having in reality and why.